You're going to love this one, guys. This week it is a hamstring masterclass with the man himself, Dr. Mac, and along with him, Adam Russell, physio to the Gold Coast Titans. Let's enjoy.
Welcome to the Body Science Podcast, bringing you everything you need, want and should know about health, fitness, nutrition and training. As always, the information contained in this podcast is for the information purposes only and is not designed to diagnose or be prescriptive to treat, prevent or manage any injury, disease or other health-related condition.
Burn the fat and feed the muscles with this high-protein, low-carb, low-fat, best-tasting daily protein powder. Hydroxyburn-lean 5 proteins are released in a sustained chronological order, therefore maintaining their different absorption rates, fast and slow, ensuring constant muscle fuel, so you stay fit, happy and healthy. This synergistic blend also includes 17 vitamins and minerals, added carnitine, and a proprietary blend of digestive enzymes, Digizyme, and Orafti prebiotic to aid digestive health.
Hey, welcome to Body Science HQ, the home of Fit, Happy and Healthy. Today with me, the big dog, Dr. Mac. We're going to talk about debilitating injuries in sport and exercise, the common ones, that is. And you've brought on a special guest today who you believe is one of the best sports and exercise physios in the market.
Yes, mate. So it's a big plug. We're going to talk about really only going to nail possibly the most debilitating injury in sport and exercise. We're going to talk about hamstring strains today. So Adam Russell's in the house. Adam and I go back a long way. We did physio together back in the day. For those that didn't know, that I am a physio, but I don't. I keep that under my hat.
You've got a master's in physio, haven't you?
I do, but
yeah. What about you, Adam?
Yes, I've got a master's as well as a master's in sports and exercise physio.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know if you want to do the intro or what you want to do.
I first met Adam when I was going to surf the Maldives and I needed a bit of back work, but the real reason is he is the head physio at the Titans. So you've been there 2 years, 3 years?
Yeah, second year now.
Second year now. How'd the boys go hamstrings last year? Mac, do you want to tell us?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, but Adam comes, he's been around, mate. Gold Coast Suns, Queensland Reds.
You got the Reds?
Yeah, I was at the Reds back in 2005 to 2007. Okay. And then went to spend a couple of years at the Lions, Brisbane Lions in the AFL.
Right. Yeah. So there's, like most things in our world, there's often some misconceptions around, injury, how injuries occur, what injuries, what constitutes injury, what type of injuries are occurring, because there's a number of different types. The hamstrings are complicated. We talk about this all the time.
Do you want to talk about the mechanics of it?
Well, we'll get to it, and I'll get Adam to contribute. But, the glutes get a lot of publicity in the fitness world, and as I've been on the record saying that, glutes are easy to train, whereas hamstrings being biarticular in nature in that, bicep femoris anyway, I should say, is biarticular, which means it crosses two joints at the hip effectively and then at the knee. So that presents some unique features around the mechanics of it. And I think we'll get to that. I think we'll probably touch on the anatomy a little bit early on, just to give us a brief overview of the hamstring complex itself, what constitutes an injury, and then we'll talk about, because there's some modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors that might increase your propensity for injury. And that is, obviously, there's some things we can perhaps improve, and there's some stuff you can't do anything about. And so age and things like that. And then I think we'll get into probably more where Adam will have, comprehensive contribution around getting an accurate diagnosis, what that looks like, what are the different types of injuries, and then ultimately we'll get into a chat around, what are some strategies around eliminating risk or mitigating risk, and then getting people back on track, because re-injury is huge, right? So I don't know if you want to talk now, Adam, but so that's where we want to head for the next half an hour or so, just talking about that. Yeah.
Anyone who wants to check out Adam, it's at Adam Russell Physio on the big Insta. How's it rate compared to yours?
I'm sure it's not quite as comprehensive as mine.
Okay.
Mine's killer.
I don't have a cat on mine.
You don't have a cat?
I'll put that out there.
Yeah, well, I think, we all need a wingman, and my little man, Brucey, he goes all right. I rescued him, mate. It's all good.
I like it. So hamstring masterclass, let's go. Where are we at?
Well, let's talk anatomy. Let's talk, I don't know, Adam, if you want to run through the muscles that make up the hammy itself, and then we might get into some of the complexities around mechanics leading to, or what type of mechanics lead to injury. Let's go through that.
Well, we'll start with the hamstring muscle group. There's actual 4 muscles that make up the hamstring complex. So there's the most commonly injured, which is the one on the outside, which is the biceps femoris long head. It also has it has a short head component as well to it. And then you've got...
When you're saying long heads and short heads, what are you talking to for the punter out there that doesn't get what you're
So
talking
the long
about?
head is the biarticular one. So it actually has a slip that attaches up into the hip joint and then also attaches down onto the outside, so on
So it's
your
longer.
fibula, which is your little bone on the outside just behind on your knee.
Yeah.
And then your short head actually starts up halfway down your thigh bone.
Okay.
So that's your long head and your short head. So they make up your lateral complex of your hamstrings. After that, you've got your medial complex, which is your semitendinosus and your semimembranosus. Now, they're not as commonly injured. Long-headed biceps is by far the most commonly injured of the 4, and that's probably where we'll spend most of our time today, because that's where.
So why is that most commonly injured? Well,
Great question. So if you think about the function of the hamstrings, what does it do? So the hamstring extends the hip, so it puts us into an extension position, and it flexes the knee. So it shortens the angle at the knee. So it plays a role, if we cut to the chase, with regard to running mechanics. Okay, so one of the most, and there's, for the haters out there, we can argue the toss around current evidence-based practice with respect to when hamstrings are most commonly injured. The vast majority of research would support the position that says that as you bring your foot down to the ground as you're running, as let's say I'm running along, as I bring my foot down to the ground, I am going to extend through the hip as I bring my leg down, and I'm going to extend at the knee. I'm going to straighten out my leg. So we call that the terminal phase of the swing phase. So my foot's off the ground, that's the swing phase. So the terminal, as in the end of that phase, as I bring my foot down to the ground for what's called heel strike, is vastly considered the point where we tear our hamstring. Now,
is that because it's taking all the load?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's being pulled at both ends,
Okay.
effectively, right? So you have this position whereby it's at its maximum or peak tension, effectively. So if anything's going to have a problem, it's going to be when it's under the most load, effectively, right? So there is also an argument or evidence that would support that when your foot hits the ground, there's a comprehensive amount of load that's also borne by the hamstrings. So maybe that's another point where it tears as well. And you know what? Probably. There's no one and only way in which people tear their hamstrings. So that's one of the key features or one of the key considerations around when it tears. Now, when you're running along, you may not feel it till you're sort of halfway through your foot being on the ground. And that's when you'll see people grab their hammy and they go, "Oh, I'm in trouble here." And so that's one of the most commonly, reported points of injury with regard to the hamstring. And that's important, right? And that's important for getting into a conversation now around, well, what are the risk factors associated with that? And I'll get Adam to contribute in here around, sort of modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors. So there's been a lot of work done by some guys, Dave Opar, and there's a whole...
Tony Shield.
Yeah, Tony Shield. And they're local people from Australia who've done a lot of really good research around hamstring injury, what causes hamstring injury, what are the risk factors associated with that, and they've been big, and we'll get to it, talking about exercises like the Nordic hamstring exercise that's been grabbed from the rehab world, in my opinion, by the mainstream health and fitness world, and being sort of shotgun approach given to everybody to try and develop hamstrings, and it's not what it's for.
Yep.
But we'll get to that. So, I mean, Adam, you want to make some contribution around some of the modifiable versus non-modifiable things?
Yeah, look, the non...
Before we start here, are we talking about an athlete or just
everybody?
Everybody.
This is
Okay.
humans.
Yep,
This
fine.
is
Yep.
anyone.
Yep.
So this is your elite athlete who's going out and doing high-speed running on an AFL field, a rugby league field, rugby union field, as well as the punter that's just the weekend warrior that's going out and playing at a community level, or the person that's out going for a run.
Yep.
Does some fartlek work, does a bit of speed work. So
Bit of hit work, mate, bit of high-intensity intervals, garage training.
Love it.
What do you call it? What do you call your stuff? Junkyard dogs.
Junkyard dogs.
Is that what it is? No. No? Good. Continue.
Yeah.
Sorry, mate.
So the
Speechless.
non-modifiable risk factors is the biggest one is, have you hurt your hamstring before?
Yep.
So pretty much out of all of the research that's gone on the predictors of injury, if you've had that injury before, you're more likely to get it again versus the bloke that hasn't.
Okay.
So that's one that you can't change. You can't change the past. The other one is age. So the older we get, the more likely we are to suffer a hamstring strain as well. So if you can put those two together, you've got an older athlete that's had a past history. You've got a fair chance of having it happen again.
And so the stats on that. So if you look at OPAR's work from, I think it was about 2012. They're pretty confronting stats. So I think age for every year above 24, which is not old, right? For every year, it's about a 1.3 to 1.8 increase in risk.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, and if you tore your hamstring in 2018, you are 11 times more likely to tear it again in 2019. That's a lot, right? So and you might say, well, why is that? Well, that's probably around a conversation around rehab and early return to training, misdiagnosis, and inappropriate management leads to increased scarring, and some of the modifiable risk factors like
fascicle length. So they did a great study, that group, on in the A-League. So they looked at fascicle length as well as their knee flexor strength, and they found that if you had a short fascicle length and your eccentric strength was down, you were they call it the quadrant of doom. And the longer your fascicle length and the stronger you were, the less likelihood you were of injuring. And that's at the A-League's at an elite level, so they're all full-time athletes. So if you can quite easily then extrapolate that to the local community as well.
And so a fascicle for the viewers and the listeners. We've talked about this before. If you think about what makes up a muscle, we have muscle filaments, and so we have the contractile elements. So that's your actin and myosin, troponin and tropomyosin, the little things that form what's called a sarcomere. They get bundled up into what's called, I suppose, a muscle fibre, and then we have they are then bundled up into what's called the endomysium, and then that forms a fascicle. Think of a rope. A rope's got lots of bound up little strands to it. Well, a muscle's really similar. So a fascicle is one of those strands of the rope, effectively. So when they're short or long, that's a key variable around risk of injury.
Okay.
Yep.
So are we looking at that with athletes these days? Is that something is that part of the management process?
No, it's unfortunately at the moment, it's a time-consuming thing to do. So we don't, like where I've been, we haven't gone to that
pretty
level.
Hard to measure.
Yeah, it is hard.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to measure, but there are exercises that have been reported to improve fascicle length. The Nordics one, eccentric loading. Did you talk about strength imbalances between? Sorry, I was trying to read something.
No, we haven't spoken about strength imbalances yet.
So that's some of the other multiple risk factors. So fascicle length's a big one. Even if you've got a disparity between, say, quadricep hamstring ratio or left versus right leg, if you've got really strong hammies on the left and your right is as little as 0.8% disparity, that's a factor, right? So it doesn't have to be a huge amount of variation between one and the other, because if you think about it, I'm running along over long periods of time, change of direction. All of these sort of things, rapid sprinting into jogging, into reacceleration, deceleration, all that sort of stuff. The amount of effect over time with fatigue and things like this becomes a feature. So that what might seem to be a fairly innocuous sort of thing becomes a thing.
Okay.
And flexibility, I don't know, Adam, we've all got opinions, but in terms of, I've seen people who have huge amounts. I'll flick it around. People who couldn't touch their toes never tore a muscle in their life.
Okay.
Right? Because they've got terrible flexibility, but they're consistent with their inflexibility throughout the entire musculature. Whereas people who might have great flexibility, can do, the splits and all that sort of thing, may also not get injured, but probably got as much risk of injury as those that have got none. The problem is, if left and right are different, that's a problem. And there's a number of tests around that are really simple to do, like knee to wall and different things. So if you look, we talk about the kinetic chain. And like I've said in all the podcasts, nothing happens in isolation, right? There's always a cause and effect. If you've got a disparity in ankle range, so I mean how much you can move your ankle.
Yep.
If you've broken your ankle and you've got really poor range on one side and the other side's really good, then that means your gait is going to be affected. Therefore, the amount of load that's borne by your Achilles tendon, up into your knee, up into your hip, up into your hamstrings, the whole lot are going to be influenced by that. So I mean, these are all features around risk, and part of the process at a high end with elite guys is that we screen them, right? We do the screening and we identify, well, okay, here's the problem, let's do something about it. The mainstreamers of the world in the health and fitness industry are less likely to get that, and they don't really learn about these risks until they've already torn something. So what do you do about that?
Yeah, what's some things we can do?
I look at it like a cup. So if you've got decreased, you want a cup and you want to make that cup as big as you can. Now, if you've got issues in your body, you lack ankle range, so your dorsiflexion's down, all of a sudden we're putting a little hole in that cup. So what we can do about that is try and make sure, well, one is try and improve that impairment. So if they've only got a needle wall of 2 centimetres on one side and the other side's got a needle wall of 10 to 12, which is probably more average, then we need to make sure that with the rest of that chain, the rest of that link is as good as we can. So that means making sure their calf strength's up, making sure their glute, making sure they've got hip range. A lot of those things that we can modify, we need to make sure that we keep them as good as we can to make up for the impairment up or down on the chain.
And so, Mac, you mentioned there that you run a lot of programs with athletes to monitor and look at what's going. So what is someone who is, like an executive that's training 4 or 5 times a week, going F45 or doing a HIIT session or hitting one of the gyms, what should they be doing in a preventative process? Should we be going to a physio and going, can you just check me? How am I going? Am I aligned? Do they go to a chiro and get snapped back in? For all the chiros out there, I apologise for putting it like that, but I'm sitting with 2 physios and on the head. It's just...
You said it, mate.
I love the chiro. He's all about... And I've always got different leg lengths. Maybe that's why I got hammy. But nice eyes. We'll do myths and sport later on.
No, you nearly rescued that. That's good.
Exactly. So what should we be doing? Like, do we just rock up to the physio and go, or do we go get massages regular? Like, I mean, obviously people like getting a massage, they feel like it, but you guys are talking about some specific things here in relation to, knee height and...
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important is we work out what it is that individual person wants to go to, because everyone will have different impairments, different risk factors. So I think it's really important that you work out exactly what it is that you want to do. So with some people, if we go back to the cup, if you're doing things that aren't going to completely empty the cup, you've got a little bit of leeway there. If you're wanting to go out and substantially increase anything you're doing, then those impairments become magnified. So if you're wanting to start something new, increase what you're already doing, that might be worthwhile then getting to a physio or...
So we always say go see a doctor before you start training as the general warnings that we're told to say. We should probably go see a physio.
40, though. Most people aren't going to go and see a doctor or anyone before they go and start an exercise program. Yeah. And
don't you read the warnings on labels, mate?
Do they have warnings on labels?
Do not consume more than one mother in a day.
Mate, it's a rough guide. Honestly, if you're going to be bothered with that stuff, you're kidding yourself. But so...
and the reason I say that, I've got like my gym, which you were bagging out a second ago.
I wasn't bagging your gym.
No, it's good because I bag out your insides, fair enough.
It seriously wasn't. I was giving it a rap. Junkyard Dogs is a rap. That's not a bag.
Like, I've got a lot of people who, we've got ex-colonels, we've got people who are commercial managers, we've got all types of people train males and females, all different ages. And obviously the screening process of them was, can I come and train? So what I'm saying is, should people be looking at, and you've got a screening process when you go to a PT and you engage a PT, but you are talking a different level to what a PT screen was that I was taught when I did my...
Yeah, absolutely. You don't go to a PT for a musculoskeletal screen.
So should we be going to a physio to get a little screen before we start?
You probably should, but you're not going to do that. People realistically aren't going to do that, I don't think. What I think it comes down to is it's about balanced programming, right? So if you are someone if you're in that demographic that you're talking about right there, they're probably men and women probably in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, I don't know, right? But they're probably...
And plus, right?
So they're in a demographic where they've probably got some war wounds in terms of past history. They probably do want to go and see someone and just get a screening done to see what's working properly. But for the younger demographic, they're not going to do that. It comes down to, how can you avoid it? It comes down to balanced programming. And this is my bugbear with rehab is around the programming side of things. A lot of issues we can talk about. Well, we go back to the commentary around strength discrepancies, imbalances, and that sort of thing. Now, they may be something that's happened over time, but mostly that's going to happen because of really bad programming. That's going to become someone who all they do is squat and they never do any posterior chain work, or all they do is hit. They try and do their glute thrusts and they're not going to do any hamstring work. Or if you've got bias in your training, then eventually that'll show up and you're going to hurt yourself. And so that's where, again, buyer beware, but you talk about finding someone who's got some expertise around their programming, they've got good balanced programs. If you just want to get smashed up in the gym every day, you'll probably be okay. Yeah. But once you get over, once you're into your 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s and you're going to try and do repeated sprint efforts, then there's a likelihood that something will break down and it'll probably be a hammy. Yeah. And the problem then is you tear your hammy, you've already got issues around perhaps, sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is something that happens with age and we start to lose muscle fibers or muscle mass anyway. Then, the healing's affected on the back of that, probably a slower rate of healing, and you get into this sort of downhill sort of spiral of it doesn't ever get really properly fixed. Yep. If we don't get a diagnosis, and this is one talking actually, Adam, around, if you want to talk about the different types of hamstring injuries and the location of the injuries, because then we're talking about muscle versus tendon and things like that. Yep.
So I think probably the main parts of the hamstring complex that you can hurt is the proximal tendon. So that's the part that goes in and inserts onto the bone that you sit on, your ischial tuberosity.
Yeah, right up under your gluteal fold, up under your butt cheek.
And that's more of your degenerative, that's your overuse type injury. So that's not a moment in time injury. That's I've been working in your garage, Greg, for a couple of months now, and I've just started to get this hamstring that's a bit tight. It warms up. I can then complete the session fine, and then it might be a couple of hours later or the next day, it's still a bit tight, and it's something that generally people will manage reasonably well. They might modify a bit of activity. And if we get them early in time, that can be quite an easy fix. The next one, if we go down a little bit, is where the tendon and the muscle join, and we call that the MTJ, the musculo-tendinous junction. And that's probably the most commonly hurt when we talk about a hamstring strain. In that area, that spot is the most commonly injured. And
so
then
for the people just listening, where's that? Can you explain where that is?
That's probably, so if we think of where your sit bone is, so that's probably 4 or 5 centimetres down from your sitting bone. Yep. Okay. And there's also, so you've got a proximal and a distal. So you've got one, and then you've got one probably 10 centimetres or so up from your knee. So they're the most common hamstring strains. So that's the one you're out doing a HIIT session, doing some speed work, and you feel a bit of a twing. Generally speaking, that's what you've heard. Mm-hmm. The one that's probably been on the increase over the last 10 years, and it's probably because we're looking for it more now, is what we call your intramuscular tendon or the central tendon, and that is where the tendon actually continues down into the muscle, and it's a bit like a strut. So it's a supporting structure, and they're the nasty ones. They're the ones that are often recurrent. So they're the ones that someone's had a hamstring strain, they've gone to the physio, got some strength work, they start to build their speed up, and it goes again, and that sort of continues over 3 or 4 times. They're the tricky ones, and that's where they can be hard to diagnose in a clinic, so that's oftentimes where we'll send for an MR, and that's where in a full-time footy setting, sporting setting, we'll often scan most of our hamstring strains to make sure there is no tendon involvement, because that is the different type of collagen, and it takes a lot longer to heal. Okay. So that's where if you see someone with that's been out for 8 to 12 plus weeks with a hamstring, it's that one.
Speaking of that, you often read in the paper or hear in the news, they've got a type 1 or a type 2. Like, can we define what each of those mean? Type 3?
Yeah, it used to be, it's that scale.
Grade 1, so
grading,
grade versus
grades,
type,
yes.
my apologies, grade 1.
That
grade
grading
2.
system is now being phased out a little bit, so we're going more towards, it's called the British Athletics Injury Muscle Classification.
That's way simpler. Yeah.
Way simpler.
Yeah. So what it used to be is grade 1, 2, 3. So grade 1 was less than 50% of the muscle fibers have been disrupted. Yep. Grade 2 is sort of 50 to 75-ish% have been disrupted, and then a grade 3 or a full tear is pretty much the whole.
Gonskis.
It's Gonskis.
And the only way you're grading these is based on MRI. Is that what you're saying?
No, we can grade them. We can grade them clinically. So we
Clinically?
look at your strength. We look at have you lost strength? Is there pain on contraction? Have you lost range in your straight leg raise versus the other side? We do bridge tests, so we can check all them and we can grade them. What they're now moving towards is a slightly different one where there's a number and a letter, and the number corresponds to where in the muscle that's been hurt. So whether it's an MTJ / muscle belly or intramuscular tendon, and then the letter signifies the A is the least, and then C is a complete rupture. So,
geez, the media are going to love that one.
Yeah.
It's easier. The media probably grade 1, 2, 3. Everyone sort of understands that.
Yep.
So that's for the general public. For us, we want to know where the muscle tear is.
Yep.
So that's where it becomes important as a clinician and your treating therapist to understand the difference, because we treat an MTJ and a muscle belly very much differently to a central tendon issue.
Okay.
That's where, and talking about the media, talking about strains and sprains, and they go, it's a strain. They haven't torn it. A strain is a tear.
So just jumping on the different sports, you've got rugby, AFL, NRL experience, and Mac, you played in all those areas as well.
Surely.
Which sports are getting the most hamstring issues?
AFL and soccer, just because of the amount of...
Sorry, I left out A-League, sorry. Does exist in Australia, and I do enjoy the sport.
Great game.
Yeah, it is a good game, actually.
So AFL and soccer would be by far the most prevalent.
And what's the reason for that?
They're running loads. So if you look at a rugby league player, they'll run between and rugby union. It's been a while since I've been in rugby union, but you're looking at probably 6 to 8 Ks in one of those. If you're looking at AFL, midfielders are completing up to 15K game. So if you can imagine going for a 15K road run, and every 200 metres you got to run down, pick up a ball, kick it on the run, get tackled, get back up. That's a fairly exhausting process. So the skills that are required are kicking on the run, ground ball pickups at speed, places the hamstring at a much higher risk of injury, versus league where our outside backs are probably our biggest culprits for hamstring strains, and that's just because they have to. Their efforts are more intense when they have to do them, versus a middle player who is.
Adam makes a good point. Like in AFL, if you're bending over to pick up a ground ball, so you know how I talked about hip extension and knee and all that terminal swing phase. So put into the mix an additional hip flexion. So you're in a bent forward position now. You've actually got more load applied to that proximal tendon of the long head of the bicep femoris. So you've got increased load. So the mechanisms around the game will increase the propensity for that. Plus, you think about running single leg stance and kicking. The mechanics of that, go up, take a mark, land on one leg, for example, and then have to take off. Like someone's on your back.
Yep.
There's a whole lot of increased loading parameters around that are going to increase your risk factors around. And AFL, I mean, they have a ton of hammy injuries, and it's a bit of a catch-22 because as I said, as the strength conditioning coach in me takes it very personally when people tear their hamstrings, because I think there are injuries that occur because of those sorts of mechanisms. Someone's on your back, whatever it might be, collisions, all that sort of stuff. But in terms of the running loads, that's where I think there's an onus on the strength conditioning coaches of the world. We've got to get that right, because I think we can have a positive impact on the number of injuries we see around loading and gym-based loading as well. To not overload the muscle and put it in a position where it's in a pre-fatigue state that might lend itself to increased risk, basically. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think we can get around that, but the early diagnosis is key. And Adam talked about the intramuscular tendon versus the tendon proper, the MTJ itself. Yeah. So, and that leads into a bit of consideration. It's complicated, right? But then you think about the morphology of muscle, and we talk about pronation angle of the insertion of muscles on the tendon. Think of a feather, right? If you get a feather, it'll have a central tendon. Well, it's not a tendon, but whatever the middle of a feather is, and the little what do you call them on a feather? But it's
feathers.
whatever it is, right? But they're on a little angle, right? So we call that the physiological cross-sectional area of a muscle.
Yep.
So it's how densely packed the contractile muscle fibers are on that tendon. And so if you think about bicep femoris, you think about a muscle that has, we call it bipennate. So that on both sides of the central tendon, there are muscle fibers, as opposed to maybe something that's a fusiform, like a sartorius or a gracilis or something like that, that is, the muscles are aligned in a completely different longitudinal manner.
Yep.
So, there's a number of layers here to further complicate the mechanisms and the healing associated with it.
And that's why if you look over the injury statistics over the last 20 years in the AFL and NRL, would be probably pretty similar.
Okay.
We haven't really changed a whole lot with our hamstring injury rates. We've decreased the recurrences. We take probably a little bit longer. I think we're keeping them out for a little bit longer to make sure that to try and decrease the recurrence rate, but the incidence is still pretty high, and it's because of the multifactorial nature of it.
And the other complication with the re-injury is, I don't know if you want to dig any deeper into the fascicle stuff, but the other thing is around innovation. So if you think about the long head and the short head of the bicep femoris, they are innervated by different branches, effectively, of the sciatic nerve. So your long head of your bicep femoris is innervated, which means the nerve supply comes from the tibial portion of the sciatic nerve. The short head is innervated by the common peroneal branch. So you've got one muscle getting input from two different branches of one nerve. So when we have if there's a desynchronous or an uncoordinated impulse of that nerve to the two branches of one muscle, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And so what we can see, if you've got injury to the long head, the short head's been fine the whole time. So there's no real impact on the short head, but the long head's coming back from injury and there's scarring and all this sort of stuff, inflammation and, guarding and all these things that we see when an injury occurs, then that's an issue. That's something to consider with your rehab, so that you're able to get exercises or implement exercises that might work the long head as opposed to the short head. And so we can play around with, that's when we get into a conversation that I have a lot around glutes, is femur on pelvis versus pelvis on femur mechanics. So I'm talking thrust versus maybe a single leg back extension or a bilateral back extension or a reverse hyper type movement.
Yep.
And so we can look to target different portions of muscle. Even with internal external rotation of the lower shank, we can bias
medial, we can bias lateral.
Yeah, you can say the lateral complex bicep femoris versus tendinosus membranosus, just by fairly subtle shifts in the external or internal rotation of the foot.
Okay.
Or the lower limb, lower shank. So there's some pretty cool stuff we can do about that. And
what else are you doing? That strength and balance, is that the right words to use there?
Yeah, for sure. So what are your go-tos in terms of your rehabby type things? Or do you want to talk about the Nordic? I mean, it's pretty possible.
We can talk about the Nordic.
Popular.
Yeah, like the Nordic's been around for a while, and there's lots of, if you've been on Twitter over the last 5 years, there's been
What's Twitter?
Yeah, I don't know. He means Instagram.
Yeah, okay.
Some of us are still on Twitter. But no, there's been a lot of wars between, the Vern Gambettas and the Franz Bosch of the world versus...
what are they?
They're people
Yep.
who have a level of expertise in the field.
Okay.
So Vern's got a track and field background, as does Franz. So they're very much train the muscle, train the movement, not the muscle. And the Nordic exercise is very much a train the muscle type exercise. So I think you certainly need a combination of all of it. The Nordic exercise has been shown to decrease injury rates. So I think I always keep an open mind. There's no such thing as a bad exercise. It's just a poorly prescribed one. So I think the Nordboard is the device where we measure the strength.
So you're doing Nordic exercises pre-rehab, or are you doing it as part of? Yep.
No, we do ours. We'll have them as part of the gym program.
Yep.
There's a lot of evidence to suggest they do change fascicle length, even though it's an exercise over the knee, which tends to bias more the medial, so the semitendinosus muscle. I think you need a combination of knee exercises that work the knee, as in a leg curl, a Nordic, and exercises that work over the hip, your single leg back extension, your RDL. So I think you need a combination of all of them. Yep. And with that, you can also then look at speed of movement, preparing you for what you need to do. So if you're a speed athlete, a sprint athlete, you need to be doing exercise in the gym that are also working over that sort of speed of movement.
And so where the Nordic has, I think, lost its way a little bit, in that situation that Adam's just talking about there, absolutely there is a justification for having it in there, right? And we know that most people at the elite level or like you see on Instagram people going all the way down, coming all the way up. I reckon I've only seen half a dozen footballers able to do that ever. You know, Preston Campbell, remember Preston?
Yep.
He weighed about 68 kilos, Preston. He could do them all day. You know, whereas if you got some big unit who's 120 kilos, he's not going to go all the way down to the floor and come all the way back. If he does, he's a freak. And I mean that as a compliment. So the benefit to the Nordic is the eccentric component that lends itself to the fascicle length adaptations that reduce the risk of injury for tearing your hamstring. Now, if you're a running athlete of anything, hockey, basketball, it doesn't matter, enormous applications, right? But if you're a bodybuilder, you say to yourself, why do I really need that? It's not going to give me a large amount of cross-sectional area necessarily. There are other exercises that are much lower risk that can develop hamstring cross-sectional area. So, you know, a leg curl will do a better job than a Nordic for increasing the size of your hammy.
Yep.
So that's where I think we should be cautious in the mainstream health and fitness industry around, I suppose, on shopping around and just grabbing exercises from one environment and thinking, oh yeah, that looks pretty good. You know, I feel that in my hammies. My hammies are sore for 5 days after I do it. Absolutely, because it's a completely foreign stimulus, huge eccentric load, large amount of delayed onset of muscle soreness, DOMS, which comes from micro trauma, not from lactate. But anyway, we'll talk about that in our next podcast about myths. You know, it's called, like, I guess, benefit to risk ratio, because one of the things we can see is an increase. You'll tear your hamstring if you just walk into a gym and try and do a whole lot of Nordics. You're probably going to tear your hammy. You know, if you're overweight, deconditioned, and things like that. So you've got to have a strategy around the implementation of that. And this is what I see. A lot of people get on Instagram, and I know I'm on a rant, but they'll get on Instagram. They'll see someone who's in great shape,
absolutely,
doing wonderful exercises like the Nordic hamstring, and they go, "I want to do that." You can't just go and do that. You've got to work up to it.
Yep.
And some people will never get there. Anyway, that's my little rant. But so there's a range of things that have to be considered there with regard to what we do. What are your top 5? If you want to develop hamstrings and mitigate risk in the hamstrings, what would you be putting into the programs?
If I'm talking the population that I've dealt with, which is elite athletes, probably my number one, I love the single leg back extension.
Yep.
And also an RDL and even a single leg RDL if you've got the pelvic control to do it. There's lots of variations we can do. So we've got the one exercise where we can change speed of movement, we can do the range, we can rotate around it. So I love those two. And they're obviously more going to be biased towards the long-headed biceps, which is the injury that I see most commonly. My 2 exercises for the medial hamstrings would be, I do like a Nordic in my population because we know there is evidence that it decreases our injury risk. That's what that makes me look good. And then as simple as a leg curl, we can still play around with foot position like Macca was saying. We can internally rotate, we can externally rotate to bias the muscle grip that we want. Okay. So they're my probably 4 go-tos. I have started using a supine bridge, which is a relatively new exercise, I suppose, which is just where you're got your shoulder blades on the bench and your feet are on another bench and you hold yourself up. So I quite like that one for an isometric component and some changeover. Changing legs, so single leg, changing from right to left. So they're probably my 5 go-to exercises for hamstrings.
Nice. So glute bridges, so everyone's about the thrust, right? Everyone in the health and fitness industry, I'll bring it over to the health and fitness industry. Everyone's about the thrust. So when I say a glute bridge, I'm talking about your shoulders on the floor and your feet are on the floor. Whereas a glute thrust, some people are calling it a scorcher. So Contreras and that crew called it, I think they call it a scorcher, where your shoulders are on a bench, so you're elevated. So if you do your glute bridge, you're still going to get, actually a lot of stuff that says a glute bridge from the floor will give you much larger hamstring component even than say a squat or even into some of the deadlift movements.
right?
So, yeah. So you'll still get some component of that versus the scorcher where your shoulders are on a bench. So there's a few different things you can do. Deadlifts are a hammy must, really, and the Romanian variations on that with the slight bend in the knee and things like that. And that's where the progression is usually in rehab. It's and Adam can contribute as he sees fit. But so we look at getting range. So if we don't, and you could probably talk about this, mate, but one of the things we need, if you tear your hamstring, right, you'll have a lot of guarding and you'll have some disuse atrophy. One of the things with disuse atrophy, what I mean is if you don't use it or lose it philosophy. In terms of...
And just on that atrophy too, you've also got a neuromuscular inhibition too.
Correct.
So you have a decrease in firing. So if you've hurt your hamstring, we have a decreased firing and decreased activation of that muscle. So that'll also lead to selective atrophy. So you can be doing all of your exercises, but if you're actually not... that long-headed bicep, if it's not coming on and everything else is taking its load, we're going to return that athlete with still a weak weak link.
And the I guess the bias towards that is your higher motor unit, so your fast twitch muscle fibers. So your type 2 muscle fibers will atrophy or shrink more rapidly than your type 1s. So there's a strength and a power component that comes with that, and even a cross-sectional area issue with that. So, these are things that you've got to take into consideration. I've completely lost my train of thought. Doesn't really matter. But with your rehab, that's what I was going to say. In terms of looking at, unloaded to loaded, stable bases of support, we look at looking at getting range. Because if you don't have range, then, you're going to load the muscle in a compromised position effectively. So we look at inner range and getting range back. Then
I'll also start with an isometric. So we can generally start them, even 2 days post-injury. We'll start them on some isometric, which is just where the muscle is not changing length. So we can do that in a number of different ways.
Well, isometric, increase in tension without a change in length. Yeah. So
we can find areas
but you can load it.
What we do is we find areas where they're pain-free, and we can load it in a pain-free environment, so we're not having an increased amount of time where we're not getting some strength in.
Yeah, and you move in from sort of maybe body weight into loaded, and then you might go back to more complex movement patterns and then load them with complex movement patterns. It's the same with running type of activities. We tend to progress them. If you can't walk pain-free, you definitely can't run, right? And if you can't, then we talk about the term awareness. So when they're in their rehab running progressions, we want to keep them in that stage where they're not really aware. So the progressions are lower intensity up into higher intensity, and then into changes of acceleration, deceleration efforts. Because if you want to really load up your hamstring, you get into deceleration. Did I sound like I had a stutter then?
No, it was good.
So backwards running on a treadmill, things like that will tend to really load up your hammy. So there's a lot of different activities you can do.
Yeah, I tend to.
I tried that the other day, backward running on a
I'm not recommending you do it,
that is really
but I see it happen all the time.
That's
really why I
difficult.
mention it. Yeah. If you want to hurt yourself, do it really fast.
That's what I thought. That's exactly what I thought.
None of my boys do that.
No.
But we generally go with, as soon as they can walk pain-free, we'll get them to walk. I'll get them to walk laps of the oval for 30 minutes an hour.
Yeah.
And then we go from that to a walk jog. So they might, a time, 30 seconds on, 30 second jog, 30-second walk, or jog the sideline, walk the try line, or variations of that. And then we just gradually increase them. I think too, we talk a lot about, in hamstrings, you talk a lot about exercises and we talk about gym stuff, but one of the things I think we do quite poorly is our rehab running and getting them ready to go. And I think that we've got to have a systematic plan in place that we gradually expose them to higher intensity in their running. I think, if we go back to sort of that acute chronic workload stuff, you're prepared for what you can do anything that you're prepared for. So we've got to make sure that we don't increase their sprint work too quickly, and I think that can be, we sort of get them jogging and we go, yep, they're good to go, you can now go and sprint, and it's not as easy as that. Yeah,
and you would get slammed with it all the time. So what's your protocol? Everyone says, I get asked all the time, so there's no cookbook approach to this. I mean, you definitely have your general plan around exactly what Adam just said around progressions, but what you'll need for your hammy will be different to mine, will be different to Adam's, whatever it might be. So, and it's a process,
you
right?
Start with the end in mind. So I know exactly where, all of our boys will wear GPS, so I know exactly on average how many Ks they'll do in a game, how many of those are high intensity running meters. So then we need to match that to their rehab programs, so they don't come back until they've reached those goals. So it's really important, and anyone, even the weekend warrior or the recreational athlete can do that. They know where they've got to get to. So then it's a matter of working our way towards that in a sufficient time frame.
So how much time are the boys spending with you once they do tear something?
If with a physio, we'll be with them every day. And every club and every organisation will be slightly different with how they do it, but I'll take them. And it depends too. A grade one, we had a couple this year where they didn't miss a game, and others where they might miss one. We had one who missed 8 weeks with more like 10 weeks with an intramuscular tendon. So it all depends on getting the diagnosis right and then working from there. So they'll be with us every day. We're checking them every day. We're monitoring their strength, monitoring their GPS. So they're with us for a fair bit.
It's a holistic approach, Greg.
Yeah, you're all over that, aren't you?
Love it, mate. It's a journey, all right? You get on a rehab journey.
You love that word, journey.
Yeah, one of the best.
So, guys, Hamstring Masterclass, for those of us that don't have elite sporting scientists, doctors, physios, masseurs behind us, what do we do? I'm talking about the person who goes, I'm going to run half marathon, I'm going to run, the typical, I want a journey. I said that for you, Mac. But you got to train for something, and people look for events to train for, and you see it all the time. People start running, and if you're not a runner and you run your first K and you finish, when you get past that oxygen is burning my lungs part, and you start to actually pick a bit of speed up, and you're running on the side of roads and all that. Like, what should we be doing?
I think one thing we do quite poorly generally is strength work. Yep. So I think and I see it all the time, especially in calves, but also in hamstrings, where someone will tear their, have some hamstring pain and then rest it, and they'll rest it for a week or two, and then they feel, hammy feels
good
great.
To go, start running.
Then they go back to where they finished from. And what we haven't done is, so we've got all those things we've mentioned. We've mentioned neuromuscular inhibition, atrophy. So we've now taken a muscle that's even weaker and then loading it back up again. So I think having some background level of strength involved. So if you are planning on doing a half marathon, a marathon, it's giving yourself enough time, and you've also haven't done a lot in the preceding years. It's really important that you give yourself enough time to get some strength back into you, and also gradually increase your activity level. You see so many, especially around, getting to this time of year, and also in January where all the New Year's resolutions come in, and they go, I'm going to go.
Get some shoes, go for a run.
Yeah. I'm going to 45. I'm going to do 5 classes a week. And that's great, but you've bitten off a bit more than you can chew there.
And I would rewind that back a little bit. One of the things that maybe it's an urban myth around stretching, don't stretch. If you what I find a lot of people.
This is where I'm heading to. Like, what does an average punter do? They stretch.
So if
before,
you hurt your
after,
hammy, right? If you tear your hammy, one of the ways to try and avoid tearing your hammy is avoid scenarios where you. Like, for example, we live on the Gold Coast, right? So people want to go and train down the beach.
Yep.
So training on sand is a really unstable surface. If you are relatively deconditioned, that is a greater stimuli on top of a new stimuli anyway around loading of your hamstring, because the sand gives way behind you, right? So you get an accentuated extension moment at triple extension, which is through ankle, knee and hip, right?
Yep.
So one of the things when I'm dealing with rugby league players and AFL players, big units, I try and have a minimum number of variables within running anyway. So what I'm saying is I don't want to go and run on concrete, bitumen, grass and sand 4 days in a row, right? It's 4 different stimulus. Think of them as Formula One, motor cars, right? I want to keep them in a pretty stable environment. So let's just avoid the variables and let's keep it pretty consistent. Now, if you're a beach sprinter, that's different. You need to sprint on the beach. But the average person doesn't necessarily need to do that. The other thing that I see people doing in mainstream health and fitness is they tear their hamstring and they stretch the shit out of it. Don't do that. You know, if you've already got an inflamed, maybe it's really acute and still bleeding, what's going to happen if you keep stretching it? It's going to bleed, right? So don't avoid it. Don't stretch the hell out of it, right? You want to maintain movement. So you want to have some dynamic movement of the muscle to the point where you feel it. Okay, we call that inner range type movement at either end of the spectrum. So I might lie on the floor and I might put my hand, like I call them 90-90s, but lie on the floor, bring your hip up into 90 degrees of flexion, grab behind your knee and just straighten out your leg and you'll feel a stretch in your hamstring, right? You do that to the point maybe where you just feel awareness of it, right? But you're not going to make it any worse. I'll maintain some movement, I'll maintain some range, things like that. When they're tendon strains, and there's a lot of work being done on tendon rehab, and we know a lot about tendons and how tendons adapt to load. Tendons don't like large amounts of change. By that I mean the worst thing you can probably do is rest something completely, complete rest. Now, that gets a little bit tricky because if you don't have a lot of expertise around you, you know, how much or not enough is a bit of a variable. But in a high performance environment, you know, in terms of injury risk, we load tendons most days. So whether you do a low, moderate or high loading scheme, we'll sort of do that in an undulating type of fashion because tendons don't like to be overloaded and they don't like being underloaded. Okay. So they need consistency of load. So for the average person who decides I want to
10Ks.
I want to run 10Ks.
Yep.
Don't start your training program to run 10Ks by running 10Ks.
Yep, fair call.
Right? Start at a K. Let's get through it and let's see how you pull up. And let's do that for a week or two. Then we'll progress to 2Ks and 3Ks, 4Ks. Set yourself a goal so you've got enough time to get there, and mix it up. Like training surfaces are huge. Like running on bitumen in your basketball shoes is not the way to go. So that's one of the variables.
We might talk about shoes later if you guys can.
I'm not a podiatrist, but
stay in your lane. Got it.
I'm in my lane heavily.
So say I am someone who's going to start a 10K journey, because you like your journeys, Mac.
Yeah.
How do I know if I've done my hammy? You often see people running and they're on the side of the road and they're bending over like they're stretching their hammy or they're stretching their calves.
Yeah, again, it depends. A grade one, have had people that haven't noticed till the next day, especially if they've gone for a late afternoon, early evening run. They're fine. They get home.
No magical pop.
No. Sometimes with those, and that's what
magical
we call
pop is something more serious than a grade one.
Yep.
Yeah. So if we go back to the old terminology, that'd be a grade one. You know, or you might go to you're home having dinner, having a shower, and you think, oh, geez, my hammy feels a bit funny there.
How's it feeling? Like what's happening?
Painful, tight.
Like someone sticking a needle in it, or like
no. But if you've got something that's hanging around, right? If you've got
twinging's probably a good
twinge side sensation. So there's a difference between muscle soreness.
Yes, this is what I'm trying to establish.
Yeah. So the difference, if it's okay, so if you go and do a new gym program, you can expect to have a level of muscle soreness, right? But it should dissipate within a relatively short period of time. Let's say 48 hours, 72 hours. If something hangs around and let's say you go and do a brand new gym program and everything's sore. I've got sore quads, I've got sore hammies, calves, the works, right? If it doesn't resolve within, say, 3 to 4 days and my hammy's still really sore or really catchy when I walk or when I have to do something, then there's a likelihood, and it's not particularly diagnostic, but there's a likelihood that I've perhaps overloaded my hamstring.
And the other thing too is with DOMs, you should reasonably expect it on both sides. So if you've got DOMs in one side, that's
exactly right. If you do a new gym program and only my left hamstring is sore and my right one's fine, unless you did a whole lot of single leg training, you probably expect consistency throughout in terms of the level of soreness. So things like that will be indicative of, I've probably done too much. And then it's about acute management. Your first aid, your rest, ice compression, elevation, all that sort of stuff. And
with rest, we talk relative rest.
Relative rest. I don't mean go and sit on a couch and do nothing for 5 days. You can still walk, you can still do all those sort of things. But I think that's where people perhaps don't get that acute management right, and it'll just exacerbate the condition. And
So
Unfortunately, in the clinic, I'll often see the person that's done it 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
So it's not until then that the
It's
penny
a real
drops.
grind when they come to you.
Whereas sometimes too, if we can get them in early, we can set up a program. We can set some timeframes for them too. We kind of know, okay, if we've got this type of presentation, it's going to take you this many days or weeks to get back to where you want to be. So I think that's also important. We get that accurate diagnosis first, and we can set up timeframes, and then everyone, because what we don't want to see is that person who thinks it's going to be a 2-week injury and it ends up being a 4 to 6. And that can be really frustrating, especially when you're trying to get into a new routine. So I think it's nice for us to see them early, and we can put in plans in place for them to make sure they're getting, doing the right things, getting the right amount of strength, and they're not doing too little or
So
too
say
much.
you and I are going to go run the 10K at the Gold Coast Marathon, for
You two
example.
can die.
No, yeah, I know you're not. Let's just say we are, and so you're not treating me, you're running with me. So we're not doing anything before we run. We're just going to go light jog into...
Depends what the session is.
Yeah.
If we're just going, if
So
I'm
it's
just
You gotta
straight-
warm up.
I'm just running. Like all I'm doing for my 10K training is running.
You'll need an hour warm up on your legs.
I
I'm
need a
joking.
lot of encouragement too, but I'm just trying for the people at home that just run. Like everyone's New Year.
See,
like you said,
the other thing is this: why are you running? Like, because
yeah, I know. That's why I'm not looking at you, Macca, because we've had this discussion.
So this is what I would say to the people.
Because people want to do a 10K run. That's why they're running. Yeah. I know you don't agree, but there's.
I know there's people that want to do that.
Yeah, and there's lots of
But
people that
what I'm
don't run
talking
any
to
other time of the year. They only run for this.
Yeah, I
They're the
know.
ones I'm trying to.
I'm talking to the people who
talk to
think they're
Adam
running
about
to
right
lose
now.
weight, though.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about someone who
right.
wants to run 10Ks and they've given themselves 5 or 6 weeks.
Okay.
So, obviously, at home we might have a band, we might have some ice, we might have a
You
roller.
got a band at home?
Yeah, I do.
Live band?
Yeah, that's it. Every morning it gets up and plays. So that's what I. So that's what I'm getting at. Like I'm trying to pull this down from elite level to everyday punter that wants to go for a run, and I'm not talking someone who runs for life. I'm talking about someone who wants to start the journey, Mac, to the 10K.
Yeah.
So it's day one, and there's a good chance something's going to get that little twinge or whatever you called it before because...
and if I'm looking at that person, so if I'm developing a program for them,
Now you live in the street and they say, let's go for a run. So you've just started running. You've had no time planning with them. You just, let's start running.
I would never do that.
Yeah, okay.
I'm always a plan. But look, if
We are running in a lane though because we're running roads. So
Yeah.
where are we at
Hedges
here?
have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to work this out at a basic level. Like
There's no reason why you can't start.
it's a prevention too. This isn't cure. Like I'm talking about, should I be rolling before I run? Should I stretch? Should I ice up after every run? Like it's just those questions I want to ask you.
Yeah,
for the basic everyday person at home who wants to know more.
If we're trying to get someone active, I whatever gets them active.
I'd
So
give
if
them
they don't
caffeine.
like,
That's how I do it. But
that's nice.
past
A
that.
bit of hydroxyburn shred.
good product
position
off, hey?
placement, hey?
Okay. Proud sponsor of the Titans. I'll be happy you said that.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
I was about to say that.
This conversation's deteriorating really quickly. Podcast fatigue.
I'm talking about someone wants to start training for a 10K. They don't have a coach. They don't have a PT. They've just gone, let's sign up at work.
Yeah, my general rule is always do a little bit less than what you think you can do.
Yep.
So that's
Easy for me. That's most people I run with, actually.
Yep. So if we're looking for what do they want to do before, do what they want to do and what's going to make that easy. If they like to roll.
Yeah.
If they want to do some band work and get some glute activation, some glute priming, great. If you just want to go out and just do a 3K road run, I don't think you need to do a whole lot of prep for that because you're not going to be running at a speed that is going to put your hamstrings at risk. But if I'm not going to tell someone you need to do a half-hour routine before they run if they don't want to do it.
Yep.
Because I want to make it as easy for them as they can.
Yeah.
So I don't have any hard or fast rules with that. If I've had a look at them and I know that they've got some impairments that we need to work on, then absolutely they're going to do some stuff a little bit beforehand and a little bit afterwards. But if they don't have any issues to start with, I don't tend to make. I've got no hard and fast rules on that.
So I'm just going to talk
And
about...
they're probably not at risk of tearing their hamstring.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I'll use myself as an example, don't run. I do a lot of that HIIT style training, which you wouldn't call HIIT, but I call it HIIT.
Yeah, it's
At
HIIT.
my age, it's HIIT. So every now and then we'll say, let's go do a 10K, do a 10K of that. The first one kills, like pure pain, 2Ks into it, I cannot get enough oxygen through my chest. But, within a week or two, you're hitting that in half the time. And I'm talking someone who sits in an office all day and doesn't run. And you're hitting some pretty big speeds. You're definitely running faster. And that's when someone who you don't feel your hammies in the first couple apart from just the pain of running, but then you go for that jog after work where you feel good and you go, well, geez, what was
That's a load thing though, mate, by the sounds of it. Like
that's what I'm talking about. Like what do we do for people like?
I think you've got to, and that's where probably I'll always have a plan, because I don't want to then just go, and then come up with whatever I feel like doing on the day if I'm not prepared for that.
Yep.
So that's the really big key for us or for me, is to make sure that you're what you're doing is you're prepared for. So if you haven't done speed work for a while, we need to build into that. So we need to gradually take you up to, 70, 75. I'm generally a sort of 5% kind of guy. So gradually do that over a couple of weeks. So if you go out and do something that you're not prepared for, that's when we're going to come in. And that might not be a hammy issue, that might be a calf, but that's where we've got to be really careful of, is making sure that we take our time to get to that goal and don't try to achieve it tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm trying to get at. What things should we do from a preventative side on a daily basis to assist? Like, should we be rolling after every run?
No, I don't think so. The thing for me, I try don't just keep in the back of your mind. I always say don't triple load a muscle in 24 hours.
Yep.
Right. So there's a lot of people train a couple of times a day. They might do a morning gym session, go for a run at night, another morning session, things like that. You might do a group fitness class on a Monday morning.
Yep.
You might get home from work and you go, I feel pretty good. I'm
Feel
going to
good,
go to the gym again,
Yep.
or I'm going to go for a run,
Yep.
and I'm going to do another morning HIIT session the next morning, right? So let's say that the vast majority of the exercises in that group fitness session were lower limb based. So I've loaded my hammies Monday morning. I've gone for a run on Monday afternoon, loaded my hammies again, and then I've done it again on the Tuesday morning. So in 24 hours, you've done 3 workouts, right? So that's a lot. And I think it's about just plan your week a little bit around what you want to do. So now, different if you're going to do a swimming session or something that loads the upper body in the gym, that's different. But my rule is no triple load in 24 hours. And you can mitigate a lot of the risk around that. And again, sometimes people don't realise if they go and do a high intensity interval session, organised group fitness session, they may end up doing a whole lot more than they thought they were going to do before they got there. Particularly if you're not, if it's just turn up and do the workout.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
You don't know what you're going to do.
Yep.
So I think there's some issues around that. Hydration status is huge.
Yeah, so stay hydrated is a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to keep your hydration status up. I think what we do know is that stretching does nothing for recovery, right? So stretching is something that you will do to increase range. And we do it when you're warm after a workout, because that's when we got a lot of blood flow to the muscle and we can increase the range of movement, right? So, but in terms of bona fide healing, stretching is not a modality to increase healing in a muscle.
Okay.
Right? Foam rolling, it's going to increase blood flow to the area. Maybe there's some sort of, relaxation effect with that as well. Good. There's no reason why you can't. You can foam roll as much as you like. You're probably not going to hurt yourself. It's going to hurt, if you're doing with trigger points and things like that. But there's no reason why you can't do that. If you like to foam roll, foam roll. I don't have a problem with that. But it's more around have a little bit of a method to your madness. And if you're just going to go, well, if you're going to do the 10K runs and you give yourself 6 weeks to do it, you're probably going to have more of an overload type of injury than you are an acute muscle rupture. You're probably more likely to suffer from a tendinopathy or a stress reaction or something like that. That's probably going to be more likely to happen, particularly if you're running on bitumen and you're 105 kilos. There's a lot of pounding that occurs through the lower limb with that. So, yeah, I mean, there's no one answer. This is why I'm probably struggling to give you an answer on the spot. But it's probably progress into it, do it somewhat conservatively, think about how far you're going to run, how intensely you're going to run. There's absolutely no, to get going, walk, jog type scenarios are really good. So let's walk for 2 minutes, let's jog for 2 minutes, walk, jog, really effective. And then you just bring back the walk time and you progressively jog more and walk less. Things like that. There's lots of little devices, lots of tech. You got your Fitbits and you do your heart rate and you might aim for, I want to hit, my target is I want to hit 145 beats per minute. I want to stay there for 3 minutes. got your watch on, happy days. Wait till your heart rate drops back to 120, then go again. You don't have to have a trainer to do that sort of stuff. You can play around with that pretty nicely, and then in terms of your recovery, just, that's another whole podcast on recovery, but what am I trying to recover from and what am I recovering for? So have I just done a massive strength session where I've got some micro trauma, I'm going to have some DOMs, I'm going to be pretty dodgy for the next 72 hours. Well, I need to rehydrate, I need to refuel. Maybe I need some complementary modalities. Maybe I need some heat. Maybe I need some cryo. Who knows, right?
What is the go now when you feel that little twinge when you do go for a run and do you come home, your ice?
If you think you've torn a muscle?
Yeah.
I still go with ice. There's two schools of thought, but I'm still in the ice category. I'm still in the ice compress.
And how are you running that?
Depends on the body. If it's a hamstring, I'll probably go 10 to 15 minutes. If it's a more superficial like a knee, I'd probably go 10 minutes on the hour.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and get into then your cryokinetics. So if it's a hammy, I'm sitting on a bag of ice and I'm going into flexion extension. So I've got an element of movement with the cryo.
Okay.
The only time I tell people, if you're trying to increase muscle mass, which is a completely different conversation around hypertrophy and training, we don't want to mitigate inflammation, right? So we don't want to go and jump in an ice bath after a strength session, right? Different to if I'm been out in 35 degrees Celsius and I want to drop my core temp.
Yep.
Really different. So, but for I'm definitely in the hot ice camp for my soft tissue injury, acutely, because I've had 1,000 of them and it works really well for me. The usual type of thing. Heat down the track, no problems at all. After maybe day 3, it depends a bit on the inflammation and how the inflammation's tracking.
Yep.
And also too, if you're actually doing some movement, that generates heat in a muscle.
Yeah,
so you don't
for
necessarily
sure.
need to go and heat that after you've
So if it's swollen, if it's red, if it's hot, they're probably your key signs that it's still inflamed.
Okay.
So don't put more heat on something like that, right? That you'll go with your cold with a little bit of compression. And we've done some research in the compression garment space, and we've identified with body science compression garments that they will facilitate the healing process, the recovery process post-workout. They're a great recovery modality, as effective as the cold water immersion. I don't know if you remember that work we did in 2010, published that work. So that gives us an element of, because it's graded compression as opposed to some of the other garments in the world, we're getting that increased venous return, we're getting increased turnover, things like that. So what I tell people, if you're going to, cool down is important. So, I would say if you're going to start your jog, I'll walk the last couple of minutes of it, finish with a walk rather than jog, stop.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
So let's cool down with a walk. Something like that, just and rehydrate. And in terms of hydration status, if your urine is brown, the color of that coffee, you probably need some fluids, right? It shouldn't glow in the dark, even if you're drinking Baroccas. Yeah, that's nasty. Nasty. It should be.
You go see a doctor.
It should be.
That's going on.
Yeah, you go and see a doctor.
Quickly,
unless you're drinking mud. But so it should be relatively clear.
Yep.
You can track that pretty well. Things like that, and so that'll give you an indication of hydration status and. I think that you're probably on your way to being pretty responsible about reducing risk.
Nice. Any readings we should look at if we're really interested in the hammies? You've mentioned a few people's names.
Yeah. There's some work by Dave Opar and that crew. We can certainly post those.
Yep.
They're literary reviews of a number of studies, and they're good work. They're a few years old now, but still really relevant. And there's a lot of work by Jill Cook, Craig Purdom, again Aussies in the tendon space around tendon loading and how to try and avoid overload and underload tendons. It's complicated, but I think there's a little common sense element to it as well, right? And that is, if you want to run a marathon, don't go and run a marathon. You've got to build up to it.
Absolutely.
So, that's that's common sense more than anything.
Okay. And just last, I know it's not to do with your lanes, but outside of what you guys have been talking about, is a dietitian changing diets and that type of thing?
I think for us, we make sure that if there's a decrease in energy expenditure, we have a subsequent decrease in energy in
Caloric intake.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's we try a few different things. We try. There's now a collagen mix using a bit of gelatin.
Wow.
We've started using that for some of our, especially our tendon boys. But it's just making sure. I think that's making sure that if we've got body composition issues, especially with some of our bigger boys, that we make sure we stay on top of that. So that when they're coming back to run, we haven't added a few grams of fat to their body mass. But there's I think just making sure that I think that's the biggest point for me. Anything for you, Mac?
No, that's about it. I mean, I refer them. There's, in terms of nutrition for healing, absolutely. And it's not my area, but there's good capacity there for getting your sports dietitian to contribute to different. I don't even know what whether there's a current supplement or whatever, but.
There's actually some good collagen proteins coming out.
Yeah, some good
research
collagen
around
proteins and different
peptides.
things, yeah. And so, I'll be looking in that space as well, get some information around what's the best bet.
Yeah.
I don't think, totally off the reservation, but, whether or not one dietary modality or another might increase your risk, I've seen no evidence of that. So you can be your diurnal modified keto with targeted intermittent fasting without too many problems.
Jogger. He left jogger off the end.
Jogger. Man, my cardio, I walked from the car inside. That was my cardio.
Love
And some
it.
stairs too.
There was stairs. You need an elevator in here, man.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Well, Mac, it was great to have you on again, mate. Adam, thanks for coming on board.
Pleasure.
Enjoyed that. We will put some links down to. Have you got a website or anything?
I don't at the moment.
You don't? Okay. So we'll just.
The Dr. Mac. I got about 785 followers.
Let's get it to 800. Good having you on, boys. Thanks heaps.
Rock on.
Today's podcast was brought to you by our partners in Fit, Happy and Healthy, ASN, Nutrition Warehouse, DY Discount Vitamins, Fat Burners Only, Evelyn Faye, Mr. Supplement, or find a retailer online at bodyscience.com.au/retailers.